As the coronavirus continues to afflict the world, scholars and government officials have issued open letters and statements to urge leaders in Beijing and Washington to coordinate their responses to COVID-19. Today we'll talk to Matthew Corman, Associate Professor of Medical Anthropology at Stanford University, a co-signer of a most recent open letter published in New York Times, and ask him why he and his colleagues wrote that letter. We'll also be talking to Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University. And last but certainly not least, we'll also be talking to Professor Peter Kuznick, Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University in Washington, D.C., who is also the author of The Untold History of the United States. We'll ask them on the importance of U.S.-China cooperation to end this global pandemic. That is our topic, and this is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Professor Corman, why don't I go to you first? I want to ask you because I want to find out what motivated you and more than 70 of your colleagues from China and the U.S. to write this open letter that is published in the New York Times.
Sure. Thank you very much, Wang Guan, for the opportunity to speak with your audience today. This letter was something that came out of conversations among a few of us who were feeling that although networks like yours have been reaching out to scholars who've worked on China, who do research in China, who are from China, that there had been a dearth of voices, particularly in the United States, and particularly the voices of scholars based in the United States, and especially those who've worked on public health issues in China over the last 10, 20, 30, and in some instances 40 years.
Well, in the letter, you and your colleagues said leaders need to be cautious when deploying their political capital to fight COVID-19 for another reason. Relationships can take years to nurture and only moments to destroy, especially given how a tweet, a meme, or a recorded quip can circulate globally in an instant. Do you have any specific comments or any politicians in mind when you said those things?
I have a number of politicians in mind. This was, though, a letter that we carefully crafted in a way to speak broadly. We address it to officials in Beijing, Washington, D.C., and beyond. And we strongly feel that the kinds of risks that are in play here are not exclusive to any single country. And with China and the U.S., there has been an abundance of missteps and I would say reckless behavior that imperils that bilateral relationship. And I've seen, and my colleagues and I have observed, similar kinds of recklessness at times in other countries.
Well, do you think leaders on both sides, especially those in Washington, will heed your cause, given that this is a very politically charged season?
Do I believe they will? I have no way of calibrating that. This administration in the U.S. has a relatively low regard of experts and academics. So I'm not convinced that they will hear it as clearly as leaders elsewhere. That being said, that's no reason for anybody to sit on the sidelines with such a profoundly significant crisis underway. No one should sit on the sidelines. Voices should be heard. And whether or not leaders listen to them, they make those decisions at their own peril.
All right, Professor Kuznick in Washington, D.C., I want to turn to you, if I may. You and your colleagues also issued an open letter where you urged a change in global structures of inequality and violence. What are your main messages?
We see this as the result of trends in the economy globally and the political, geopolitical systems that have been going on for decades. We see that there's been a widening gap between rich and poor all over the world. There's been a defunding not only of healthcare, but other essential services that are necessary for human life. So what we're hoping for is that we're not going to just treat the pandemic itself, we're going to treat the underlying causes. So we're calling for things like ending sanctions against entire nations. We're calling for ending armed conflicts around the world. We're calling for viewing healthcare as a universal human right across the entire planet. We've got a lot of structural changes that we're proposing. So we want to use this as an opportunity to begin to solve some of the deep fundamental problems in the world. We live in a world now in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. In that kind of world, there are going to be more and more pandemics and less ability to fight them. So what we're trying to do is show the effects. In the United States, we have a country in which the richest 3 people have more wealth than the bottom half of the population, where the neoliberal economic policies that have been governing for the last 4 decades have systematically shifted wealth away from working people to the very, very wealthy. As a result, we see now the hospital systems are inadequate, these education systems are inadequate. We face a very deep, profound societal crisis. This is our chance to change it, because people are seeing the reality in ways that they hadn't seen it for a long time. So I think this is not only a terrible crisis, but it's also a tremendous opportunity if we seize it.
Well, Professor Kuznick, you studied history extensively, both the U.S. history and the world history. To what extent are you surprised that in light of a global pandemic, when people thought that countries might come together, this pandemic actually gave rise to great power politics?
Well, I'm not surprised at all, but I'm very disappointed. The Trump administration strategy is very clear-cut. Trump has handled this terribly. In fact, he's made a fool of himself. He's recently been a national laughingstock, not only on late-night comics, but all over the world. And so the strategy for the Republicans to try to win the elections is very clear. The Republican Senatorial Committee issued a 57-page memorandum recently, which they said, don't defend Trump, only defend him on the blocking of visitors coming to the country from China. But what we have to do is focus on China. Blame China, blame China, blame China. That's the strategy. And it's very, very dangerous. The idea of a new Cold War between the United States and China would be devastating for humanity. We've barely survived the first Cold War. There's no need for a second Cold War. So that would be going the exact opposite direction. So we've got the United States and China with these competing narratives now, where the United States wants to blame everything on China, and China is hitting back in certain ways. And what we need to be doing, as Matthew was saying, is cooperating, collaborating, working together to find common solutions to a universal problem.
Well, certainly that is our hope, that China and the U.S. can work together. But Professor Kuznick, do you think the U.S. and China are set for a new Cold War? Is that only inevitable?
It's not inevitable, and that's part of why we started our initiative and why a lot of other people are very alarmed by this, because we know what the consequences of a new Cold War would be. The United States, as the world's hegemon, as the unipolar nation until recently, has got to learn to live in a multipolar world. And if it doesn't do that, if it doesn't integrate the rising powers into this global system and allow them to have a hand in international governance, we're going to be back in the situation we were with World War I and World War II. And that would just be terrible for humanity. So, we look at the trends, and we know that this is not inevitable, but the people are profiting from this financially, and other people are profiting from this politically. So, and it's not just the Republicans. There are also voices in the Democratic Party who are extremely hostile to China. There are voices in the media who are extremely hostile to China. People are scared. They're looking for scapegoats and easy answers, and this is not the way to approach it. But it seems to be working. The latest surveys find that 60% of Americans now have an unfavorable view toward China. This is the highest since that question was started to be asked back in 2005. So this attack on China is resonating with some American people.
All right. We'll take a short break, and we will be right back. So Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University, I would like to go to you. As a Chinese scholar, how do you look at all this in that American scholars wrote open letters appealing their government to have a more cooperative relationship with China?
Well, I think the open letters put it very well, because the disease, knows no borders, no national borders. So actually, since this is a global pandemic, we definitely need, transnational, multi-level collaboration instead of, contestation or even confrontation. There has been some worrying, scenarios in Washington in which, politicians and also media outlets have been, finger pointing and playing this blame game against China, which actually amounts to no good to the final, victory over the disease. I think at this moment of public health crisis for the whole humanity, what we need is collaboration and coordination rather than, hostility. Words, war of words, tit for tat tactics, which actually will definitely lead to mistrust and distrust and the loss of confidence on both sides, which will definitely, lead to almost a kind of like, apocalyptic, prospect for the humanity.
But how do you think that, the U.S.-China relations can get better? How can the two sides stop this downward spiral?
I think since President Trump took office, China has been interacting with the U.S. side proactively and constructively. President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump have been maintaining this regular and proactive interaction with each other, which should be going on at this top level coordination and collaboration. That is very important to avert any likelihood of distrust or mistrust or even misunderstanding and miscalculation. So at other levels, for example, at the department levels, ministerial levels, also there has been a constant flow of communication, of information sharing, and also other interactions. These are very important to ensure the bilateral relations will actually proceed towards a proactive and constructive outcome. But actually, regretfully, recently we have been seeing this worrying sign in Washington about this political game in which actually some kind of attacks have been launched towards China. I think, especially at this moment, actually, as the open letter said, we need to cast aside any political interests, vested interests, and for the common good of humanity. And I hope actually at Washington, people would really come back to senses and actually to play a more positive role.
Well, Professor Corman, I want to go to you. On a practical level, how can Washington and Beijing start cooperating and stop blaming each other, especially amid this global pandemic?
Yeah, I think there are a number of ways. Ones that are outlined in the letter. I think they need to reaffirm a number of commitments they have made to one another, from trade to scientific exchange to commitments to international organizations. Commitments to the World Health Organization need to be reaffirmed by both countries. Commitments to academic exchange absolutely need to be revivified, and a lot of attention needs to be put from both sides. I think this is the opportunity of a lifetime for universities, for government offices to reach across the Pacific Ocean and set up a variety of communications between academics. Many of them are already in place because there have been networks of of academics between the U.S. and China for years now, developing new insights, new research, and I think many have pulled back at this moment, and there needs to be a concerted effort to reinstill a sense of common unity among academics in particular. Now, I would also really emphasize that China needs to take the long view. The United States is going through something that it really hasn't experienced since the early 20th century. China went through SARS. China went through avian flu outbreaks. This is something very, very novel in the United States. And this is an administration that is, in some ways, very immature, very quick to be divisive, to be reactive, that is constantly trying to divide. And I just recommend that government leaders elsewhere don't take the bait, that they just tone down the rhetoric, and that they just assume that there's going to be probably more of this kind of bad behavior coming out of some capitals in the world, notably Washington, and certainly over the next few months in the run-up to the elections. I just think that Beijing and capitals elsewhere need to take the long view. Don't take the bait. It's just not worth it. For the reasons outlined by others on this show already, there's too much at stake, far too much at stake. And China, I think, should lean back on its history, on its confidence in itself as a civilization, as a growing power. And there's really just no reason to even to entertain this kind of behavior. Just move on and do the hard work that's needed and demonstrate to the world leadership, and let other countries follow along.
Take the long view, don't take the bait. Sounds like a great piece of advice, Professor Corman. So, Professor Kuznick, I want to go to you in Washington, D.C. You know, talking about the increasingly hostile China policy coming from Washington, who do you think are the people that are driving the China policy in the White House? Are they the National Security Council, the State Department, or just a handful of Trump's trusted advisors?
Well, if you remember, during the presidential campaign, Trump was already demonizing China. He was threatening a 45% tariff on Chinese imports. He was accusing China of being a bad actor in many different areas. Then when in office, he started the trade war with China and started a lot of hostile rhetoric. What he did is he surrounded himself with advisors who, for the most part, shared that view. So we're talking about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We're talking about Peter Navarros. We're talking about Matthew Pottinger. These people have Trump's ear. There are others in the administration who are much more reasonable when it comes to U.S.-China relations. But they're not the ones, Larry Kudlow's and even Steve Mnuchin, but they're not the ones who've got the real influence. What Trump has done is he's narrowed the circle of advisors. People who are critical or disagree with his positions throughout the national security apparatus have been demoted, fired, or moved, or else they've left government because it's so unworkable at this point. You look at the State Department. From the very, very beginning, what Secretary of State Tillerson did was he pared it down. He cut enormous numbers of people. Diplomacy is given short shrift in this administration. Even now, it's got people calling for the Indo-Pacific Command has just asked for another $20.1 billion in order to prepare against China. So there's people in the military who are using this, in the Pentagon, who are using this to get more military funds in order to beef up their forces against China. The United States has been sending these freedom of navigation operations into the South China Sea. There's been a lot of very provocative behavior. So there are a number of people around Trump. Trump has got his advisors who are feeding him and saying, and supporting what he wants to do in terms of his hostile policy toward China.
Well, Professor Kusnik, if you were to write another episode of history, like your Untold History of the United States, which I am a big fan of, how would you describe the current U.S.-China confrontation? Do you think that is just a short-term structural shift, structural change, or that is the beginning of a great power conflict?
It's a good question. I wish I had a crystal ball. I think that sanity will prevail in the United States. We're going through a very strange period, the period of Donald Trump and his right-wing Republicans who are hostile to the rest of the world, hostile even to America's allies. But it's part of this rise of right-wing nationalism around the world, or right-wing populism, which is an extremely corrosive kind of tendency around the world. The odds look good right now that Donald Trump will be voted out of office come November. Will he leave office? Nobody's entirely sure. But it looks likely that he'll be defeated in the election. Now the question is, what will Joe Biden or the people around him do in relation to China and other situations around the world? Hopefully, they'll listen to the more progressive elements in the Democratic Party, and they'll adopt a new policy. They'll adopt the New START treaty with Russia. They'll adopt friendlier policies toward China. And we'll begin. See, right under Trump, we have this idea of make America great again. But we've got that same kind of attitude coming out of countries all over the world. What we see we need now is to view ourselves as one global people. And what we need are leaders who speak for the planet. And that's possible right now. We're in a potentially transitional period. And so if the wiser heads prevail, we can hopefully move toward a new kind of world order in which we're working together to solve our real problems, health problems, educational problems, problems of wealth, poverty, problems of water. I mean, these are all things, the climate change and the nuclear problem and militarism. These are all the things that we're confronting as a human species.
All right. Professor Chen Hong, scientists and international organizations have been warning for years of, a pending pandemic that is finally materializing, unfortunately. What types of institutions and systems do you think we need to prepare going forward to prevent the next outbreak?
Yes, I think actually we definitely need a higher degree of preparedness and alertness for this likelihood of a possible or potentiality of a future outbreak. I think actually this recent public health crisis has testified this degree of lack of this kind of preparedness. Even after, for example, even after China had suffered just the heavy losses and gave actually the world warnings and experiences about what China had endured. But in a number of countries, actually, we see an alarming degree of negligence and also a kind of half-hearted readiness to combat disease, thinking that actually it is something far away in China. But this is definitely a global pandemic. And a global pandemic, needs actually global preparedness and also global, coordination. A lot of people have been arguing about, this possibility that there will be a regression or even a stoppage of globalization. But I think actually global coordination is very important, as the open letter has stated quite clearly that we need, conjoint efforts, for all the countries and also humanity to work together towards, this is for the survival of humanity, not just for the short-term, any gains, but this is for long-term future of mankind. What is globally good is locally good. So what we need to do is actually to conjointly, to work towards this final victory over the disease and also to prepare for any future outbreak.
Right, Professor Chen, I want to ask you the question that I've asked my American colleagues. Do you think China and the U.S. are are headed for conflict, and that a great power rivalry is only inevitable. We have about 1 minute left.
Yeah, I think actually both countries have been caught in this kind of unpreparedness. This outbreak actually is a surprise attack against humanity. So I think actually in both countries, in both at either the political levels and also at the people-to-people level, actually we do not have the adequate preparedness. So I think actually what we need to have is this kind of a preparedness to avert any hostility between our two peoples and two countries, and that is actually what is more necessary than any open hostility or conflict or any other tactics that's actually in Washington we're seeing politicians are employing.
All right, gentlemen, fascinating discussions. Thank all of our guests today, Professor Matthew Corman, Professor Chen Hong, and also Professor Peter Kuznick. Thank you so much for tuning in to this dialogue.